we of course live on this land and on this timeline as well. Shall I hand over to you, Lily?
Yeah, so welcome everyone. Good morning. We're thrilled to have you at number 8 of Shifting and Stirring. Is that right, Alex? We're 8 or 9?
It's number 8, but we have actually done 10. This one got rescheduled a couple of times.
Was that my fault?
So my name's Lily Blue. I'm the Head of Learning and Creativity Research at the Art Gallery of Western Australia. I'm on Wajak Noongar Budja and have had the phenomenal opportunity to work with Ron on and off over about the last 3 years or so. I think for me, one of the most extraordinary things about working with Ron, for me personally, and in what I've watched of other people working with him, is an opportunity to stand on country for the first time, to really understand what it means to stand on country. And for a lot of people, including me, that has been a phenomenal experience of connection, both with each other and with country, that I was never invited in quite the same way to do before. Ron is a saltwater man from Bardi country, north of Broome, grew up in Geraldton, Western Australia, and now calls Wajak Noongar Budja home just like I do. So another one of the really impacting things that Ron raised in communities he's worked with is that we are both visitors on this country. So Ron and I are both visitors on this country, and that we have a responsibility here to acknowledge and tell those stories. Ron is a phenomenal artist, incredible storyteller, holder of knowledge, and phenomenally generous in encouraging people to ask really curly questions. He creates a very wide space for really honest questions to be asked and to support that happening. So I really encourage you, as Ron starts talking today, to collect those questions, because he creates a space with enormous generosity for those questions to be held and responded to. So without taking any further time, I'd like to hand over to Ron. Thank you so much, Ron, for making this possible, for being here, to working with us over all these months to put this together. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me. And I'll start simply by acknowledging who we are and where we are. I am, of course, a Bardi Umba who stands and works and lives and breathes on Wajak Budja of the Noongar nations, what we call, well, Burlu, Perth. I wish to acknowledge my all elders and country that I stand on, and where it is that you too all come from. Sit, stand, breathe, and your ancestors and your elders, because without them, we wouldn't be able to sit in a place where we could share our yarns and our stories and add layers and depth to the nature of who we are on this really old piece of land. And we're going to talk through that today in some way, and we're going to consider what that might look like to us as people who make and leave a mark, because we all do in one way or another. So I figured I might just introduce a bit of that from my point of view and encourage a conversation as we kick in from there. Thank you, Alex. So, do we, oh, there it is. So get comfy, people. You're going to be put to sleep by me. Woohoo! I don't know whether you've had the opportunity, if you'd like to slip onto the next slide, please, Alex. One of the things that I find really interesting for all of us as Australians is we're not encouraged by our society to consider who we are as individuals. We're not considered, we're not given pause enough to celebrate the nature of who we are as an individual, standing, living and breathing now today. We don't seem to have an awful lot of depth in how it is that we park our stories as Australians. I'll touch on this a little later, but just as a way of perhaps maybe giving a sense of that, I've spent 10 years in our Australian military and our Defence Force. And to have John Howard and his time reinvent the nature of what the Anzacs are to the identity of us as Australians, and catch and develop a whole sense of nationalism around that just does my absolute head in. That's not all we are as Australians. That's not all that marks us. Who are you? When was the last time you stopped to really just go, who am I? What was it that put me here? Why do you do what you do? I like that I got 3 do's in that sentence. That question, that was pretty good. When did life become what it became for you? How do you stop and celebrate all that you are? And where is home for you? And I've touched on that, and we're going to tip into that with the next slide. So if you're joining us, of course, within the boundaries of the Noongar Nation, you might get a sense of just how big it is by looking at that map. If you've been to Geraldton and you've been to Esperance, and we draw a line across that bit of dirt up there and around us, everything seaward of that line is the Noongar Nations. It's a big piece of country. It's perhaps the largest, if not one of the largest, language groups across this big bit of dirt we call Australia. And it hosts 14 nations, 14 clans. And we happen to just live in the land of one of them, Wajak Buja. And it happens to be in the biggest state on this, our island continent, which is pretty much Europe, but bigger from an Aboriginal point of view, in the world. On our Earth, the only habitable planet within our system, solar system, the Milky Way, in the universe. And then folks, there's you. There is no one else like you. No one stops to consider and make and do and reflect and interact and be who you are in the way that you are on this planet like you. There is no one like you. And I don't know if you've really ever taken the time to stop and consider who you are on the grand scale of things. And then stop and think about how it is that you make, how it is that you consider things that you do, how you present things to others on this timeline. We're always challenged here as Australians with what history has presented us as the victor's history, shall we say, what it is that's considered to be the true nature of what this glorious country is. But I've always wondered what happens if we flip it about and we just go, well, who are we? Because this timeline is just lots and lots of different layers as different people come along. I mean, if I was just to ask this group alone and you were just to put up your hand at the moment, how many of you were born in Australia? Okay. How many were born in the place that you call home now? Okay. How many of you came to that place from another place? We're a wide and varied people. Just at this layer alone. And here we are, existing in the places that we call our home, making and doing, and just looking at the world about us and trying to figure out where we sit. If we stop and put our feet down, we're adding to the nature of the storyline, the stories on this big timeline. And that means we've got skin in the game. This is our home. Whether you live in Wajak Budja, whether you live on the other side, whether you live up top, whether you live down Adelaide, whether you're in the centre, if you've arrived in this place, you've grown families, you've done things, you've taken charge of your life. This is our home. So if you haven't stopped to think about this, hey, you mob, welcome to this place you call your home. All of what makes you up, every little bit of it, you, to your old people, or to your parents, your caregivers, to old people, to your ancestors. You bring that here and you park it on this timeline now, because that's the nature of the world. I think one of the most interesting things that helps sort of just remind people about this is that Len Collard was, Len and I were doing a conversation about, having a conversation about Noongar language and just how much of Noongar language is used, of course, to inform places and street names and things around the southwest of Western Australia. And Len stopped and looked at everybody and just turned around and said, "Oi, you know what? We're all Aboriginal people from somewhere." We are. And it just so happens at this point in our life right now, you've arrived in some way, somehow, did you make on this mob's country, on this one of the oldest living timelines in our world today. And that means that you contribute to it. How many of you have children? I can see someone there. So you contribute to it in a whole pile of other ways too. We all make or contribute to the world of making. So we contribute to it again. We poke others, we interact, we have lives, we go out, we do things, we can go enjoy places that we like to see. We contribute every day to the place that we call our home. And we add depth to this old timeline. And we're going to talk about that as we go through. So shall we?
Ron, did I exit the PowerPoint too early there?
No, that's fine. Yep.
Yeah. Do you want to go back to it, or do you want to go into?
Sure. Let's go back to it
and
and just park ourselves there and see what it looks like. Oh, Struth. Okay, and then there's me. Now, I've arrived, I guess, into the world of making as an artist relatively late. I think 2019, I kicked off with a solo exhibition at Joondalup at JAG. And really, it started as an ADOC event where I was invited to come and occupy a space for a month. And they didn't expect me to occupy it like this. And what I was challenged by was, and what I'm constantly challenged by, is the notion of how it is that we consider ourselves, I guess, given our stories and how others might perceive us. I touched on the fact that I spent 10 years in the Australian military, and we'll go through and look at some of that. But what I found as an Aboriginal man who grew up in Geraldton, a boy who grew up in Geraldton, attached to a Bardi mob right up top outside of Broome, was that my saltwater business at that time in the late 60s and the 70s wasn't considered important enough or real enough to identify me as a man who contributes to our society as an Aboriginal man. Our business wasn't that important. And that later, 19 years later, I would have to take up and put on an Australian uniform, and then an Australian Army uniform, and then a Navy uniform to contribute meaningfully as an Aboriginal man to this society and reinvent myself and become another person entirely. And my life changed. And I got caught between different saltwater stories. Saltwater story of my Bardi mob on their country and their home. And the saltwater story of a place of a ship that I then joined, HMAS Australia. And those of you who come from Perth, and those of you who might recall back in 1998, HMAS Australia was the ship that caught fire in the Sound and 4 sailors were killed. One of those sailors was a friend of mine and several of my friends were injured. And I'd just left the Navy in 1997. And all I could do was, once I heard about the fire, was sit in the water chest deep and watch the ship that I served on burn and not be able to do a single thing to help those that I shared, that I lived with at sea, that kept me safe and kept me alive in that time. And that moment broke something inside of me and all the other stuff came out. And I guess I've been gently tugging that thread ever since and using my art practice to try and talk about who we are in our stories and challenge the nature of how others perceive us. So it's helped me put some stuff down, I guess, in the simplest way to put it, and pick some stuff up and share for me. And I think, given what I did, and I used to work for Artsource for a number of years, predominantly for me, working with artists, some of you, in fact, working with artists was for me about hearing your stories and why it was that you make and what it is that you do and what informs you and where you take things. And because of you lot, suddenly I got interested and started doing this. But I'm a storyteller and I tell stories. Can I have the next slide, please, Lex? And it probably started somewhere here. The 1905 Act in Western Australia meant that after the 1967 referendum sort of determined that Aboriginal people should be counted in the nation's census, and as a result, that sort of made them citizens. Cough, cough. It hadn't caught the rest of the states who had their own acts and laws controlling Aboriginal people, hadn't caught up. This is a photo sometime after my mum and dad's wedding, but they got married in 1968. My mother and father had to marry illegally down at Bicton in a church because in this state still, the nature of seeking permission for an Aboriginal person to marry was still up to the government to grant at the time. And they didn't. Instead, Dad went back to Perth where he was. My mum and Dad met in Port Hedland. My father was sent up there as a 19-year-old baby teacher. He met my mother, who came down because she was a gun basketball player out of Broome, an orphanage in Broome. And she would often get roped in for games to go down and beat the mob in Port Hedland. And Dad happened to notice this amazing woman who could just play basketball like you wouldn't believe, and decided that he wanted to get to know her, and he did. And right from that moment, they were both watched carefully by the police, especially in Port Hedland and also in Broome. The nature of an Aboriginal person and a non-Aboriginal person having relationships at that time publicly weren't necessarily perhaps maybe an unusual thing given the nature, given the top of the Kimberley, but they were tracked. My father then was returned to Geraldton. In fact, he took up a teacher's position, in Northampton, which is where I was actually born. And he sent off a letter to my mum saying, "Come down, I want to marry you." And they nicked off to Perth, found a church in Bicton around the corner from where he grew up as a boy, and got married. The priest there said, "I'll do it." And he did. That was the first legal document that my mother ever had. In fact, the only legal document that my mother ever had until she got her driver's license in the early 1990s. And that's another story entirely. Next slide, please, Alex. Now, I don't know how they managed it, but they stayed together and they put up with each other. And unfortunately, my father did pass away in 2018 from an illness. His meeting my mother changed his entire life. He grew up in Bicton, Fremantle and other areas, never really knew too many Aboriginal people. Actually went to Applecross High School for a small while, him and his twin brother. And until he went up north, he had no notion of what it was that Aboriginal people had experienced and were living through until he saw it with his own eyes. And when he came back with a fire in him. And my father spent years as a school teacher, working out of Northampton and Geraldton, encouraging the Aboriginal children in his class to take up the challenge of getting that education under their belt and helping them through things. He then decided that what he was doing wasn't enough, and he became the kind of man who just went, I'm going out to go out in the communities and help these guys make this stuff happen. And he did. Over 30 years, my father went out and helped Aboriginal people build their own business and grow their own wherewithal to be able to generate their own income and determine their own lives. Until, unfortunately, John Howard's government changed that with the intervention and brought all of that stuff crashing down. We still live in a society today that wants to pocket and put Aboriginal people as a problem people in a whole other box and take away from them the right to determine who they are as Australians alongside of us. And that touches every single aspect of our life. My mother was taken when she was 4.5 maybe years old. My mother never saw her mother again. She was kept in an orphanage in Broome. And because my mother was too dark to be sent down to Sister Kate's in Perth, and for those of you who don't know what Sister Kate's is in Perth, Sister Kate's roughly was a place where you sent really light-skinned Aboriginal girls or Aboriginal children, and you re-educated them so that they could sound like just other white Australians, and they were given up for adoption to white families. Now, there are people who swear by that and say at the time that that really worked for them, but actually most people I've seen who've come through Sister Kate's and talked to them, many of them didn't get adopted, and many of them never saw their families again, and in fact remained lost people just trying to find a place to be. If you want to know about somebody like that, you could always ask Sharon Egan, a beautiful artist, another artist here, and Sharon could actually explain to you the nature of what Sister Kate's was for her as a person who came through that process, and how it was that the kids there had to make their own family, just like my mother did in the orphanage in Broome. What my mother became was basically unpaid labour for all the well-to-do, which is mostly the Catholic Church in Broome. And kids would be up and moving at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning to do all the labour and work, get everything ready, and then out of sight by the time people start their jobs in the day. They were kept off the streets so they weren't seen. They were maintained in the orphanage in the convent, and they weren't allowed to do things. So if my mother got sick, she wasn't allowed in the native hospital because she wasn't a full native, and she wasn't allowed in the public hospital because she wasn't white. And so they all got treated back in the orphanage and back at the convent. My mother wasn't released from that until she was 18. She never saw her mother again. And it wasn't till she was about 12 years old that one of her oldest brothers was in town in Broome one day, saw her walking with some of the other kids somewhere around one of the back alleys, followed her and looked at her and went, "That's so-and-so," and then raced back and let the family know. And when they found out where she was, the family came and tried to get her back, but they couldn't. The 1905 Act wouldn't allow that to occur, and she was kept there until she was 18. My mother still feels today Well, we're in Reconciliation Week. My mother still feels incredibly guilty and responsible for the fact that she was removed as a 4 or 5-year-old child and unable to connect her sons back to the country of her mother's land. And she carries that like a weight today. Doesn't matter how much I reassure and say to you, a child that was taken away from you. My mother feels incredible shame about that. There's not one Aboriginal or Islander family in this country that hasn't been touched by experiences of the stolen generation. Our stories on this land, our stories, can be a most amazing, beautiful thing, and they can be incredibly sad as well. But they're all ours. And we get to share that and tell the truth about it. This is my grandfather. One of my grandfathers. I've got a few. The next slide I'll eventually show you, but not just yet. My grandfather stands in a very significant place on Sunday Island, up there in the Kimberley. This man made a huge difference in my life, and I'll explain that a little later. This man was one of the last of our senior lawmen before he passed away in the early 90s. And he lived between worlds. This man spoke 9 languages. He spoke all the languages of the peninsula, at the top from Broome out now, all the different languages of all the people that he had relationships with. And then he spoke Japanese, Indonesian, Malaysian, and English. Trying to count that all up so I got the right tally. In order to be able to do the business of pearling that was Broomtown and do it well and trade with others. People have been coming and going from that land and sharing in stuff and relationships for a long, long time, and not just over pearl shells. But that particular bit of land was significant for the next slide. This is that same lowground. This is one of the last photos taken of men before they were taken off and away from Sunday Island. Bardi, Joey men. And they're of course posed for a photo that was taken before the mission was removed from Sunday Island and brought to the mainland in Lumberdina. And over to the, let's see, I'm looking at this. There's a gentleman standing, looks like a younger man standing under a pointy rock there from the highest rock on that side where the arrow is, just directly below it. Oops. We got lost. So, in fact, I can do that here, can't I? Can you see my arrow here? If I do that? No, okay. Thanks, Alex. All of these men are my great-grandfathers. They wear markings on their body that tell others who they are. They wear markings on their bodies that tell others what level of initiation they've gone through and what level of law they've arrived at. They wear pearl shells on hair belts around their waist. Those who are fully initiated men ready to step in law. And it takes a long time for them to get through those stages. There is, if we were to come from my grandfather's father, is the man that is, if we look at the shield, it's the white shield with the, in the bottom left-hand corner of the image that you can see. There's a man standing up, one on his knees, the second man along in from the left with something that looks like a headdress on his head. That is my grandfather's father. This is just a relatively recent photo at the turn of the, about, I think it's about 1902 or 1903. No, sorry, a little bit later, before the First World War. where these men were taken, these photos were taken at that time for that particular purpose before they were moved across. Men have been gathering in this place for thousands of years to do their business on that island. And you can see the marks, of course, the whole way through. We have names and stories about these places that remind us that we're connected to it. The names that those men carry, my great-grandfathers, their names are given to us as a way of extending and carrying that name forward. My bush name is named for one of the men in this group. Our names are given over from our great-grandfathers or our grandfathers to the grandsons, and the same for our daughters. Great-grandmothers and grandmothers hand over their names, their bush names, to their granddaughters and great-granddaughters in order to extend that nature of who we are in our sense of self and where we belong. Can I have the next slide, please, Alex? So what I'm going to invite you to do is we're just going to step through how it is that I tend to park people in an appreciation of our timeline. And I'm going to invite you to do three things. As we step through this, and I'll introduce the notion first, I'm going to invite you to take time to consider three aspects of yourself and present it on a timeline to consider who you are as a person on this old timeline and the fact that maybe you're parked on it as well. I'm going to ask that you do this. I'm going to ask later on, and you might want to make a little note for yourself now if you like, so you can take part in this a little later as we go, but name one or two personal moments that you think have contributed to the person that you are today. What's something that's happened for you personally that's had you go there and go sideways or go somewhere or just realise who you are? And I'm going to invite you after we go through these next series of slides to actually plot that on a timeline. Yep, I'm going to introduce a timeline activity. That's how boring I am. But what are one or two personal moments that have contributed to the person that you are today? Well, I touched on some for me, and one of them is the next slide. I was a soldier. I had hair. I was even skinnier than I am now. Putting myself in a uniform and becoming somebody else meant that I could hide from the eyes of others who would only ever see me as an Aboriginal man in the town that I grew up in. But as soon as I put on a uniform, people saw the soldier or the sailor. Next slide, please, Alex. Yes, that was a long time ago. And it's remarkable because we all do it in some fashion. We hide who we are amongst other things. And we present to others this whole other self. These are all the different skins I've actually had to hide in to keep myself as an Aboriginal man in our state, in our society. Next slide, please. But really one of the ones that made the biggest impact upon me personally was serving on this ship at sea. And suddenly discovering that when things got dangerous, when things got tough, when things got really challenging, a group of people locked up in a tin can floating around in the ocean called HMAS Westralia stopped worrying about whether we were black or white, whether we were straight or gay, whether we were Christian or Muslim, whether we had hair or no hair, and actually just realised that what we needed in squeezy moments, operational moments, was that person standing right there, your mate, right next to you, keeping you safe, keeping you alive so you could see the next day. There's a funny kind of irony, I guess, in the sense that it takes us to be squeezed by life in some truly horrible ways before we realise what really matters. And I had to go through an experience through the military to actually understand that really it didn't matter what it was that we all thought we were. If we just closed our eyes for a moment and held out our hand and touched the person's shoulder in front of us, that's how real it actually is. Next slide, please, Alex.
Were we going to go into a breakout group to think about that first question?
No, we were going to present the three nations and then use that. Actually, we could probably just have a consideration. Does that work for you?
Whatever you want. I think I just got confused.
That's okay.
Right, keep going.
So really what I wanted to do was just introduce these 3 points and then have you all take part in perhaps plotting it on a timeline that's coming up after the next one. So I've got you to consider a personal moment. If you can, just write a quick note for yourself. And sorry, I forgot to say, the nature of the timeline is just make a time of the year that happened for you. Like in a personal moment, was it 1989 that you finished uni and you changed direction? Was it 98 that you went, you know what, I don't want to work on that anymore. I actually want to try this. Those personal moments. Was it in 2015 that you actually went, you know, I've actually finished with that job. I don't want to do that job ever again. I think I want to retrain myself as this. And so just make a note of the year that happened for you, and we're going to plot that on the timeline. So for each of you, just see if what you can do is name 1 or 2 professional or employable moments that you've contributed to the person that you are today. It might have been COVID-19 and how that changed so many things for all of us. The way that we've had to respond, the way that we've had to grow, the way that we've had to become more dynamic in what we do. It might be that you went and studied a particular subject and you thought that that's what you were going to make yourself become, and then 10 years down the track you went, actually that's not who I am. Or 2 years down the track I've shifted and I'm going this way, and I don't like that, I'm going this way. I'm imagining that many of you like me have had to reinvent yourself over and over and over again in all kinds of ways. And I've been pretty lucky in that way. I've managed to be able to do that without too much fuss. Okay, we've got a couple. Just keep that parked somewhere for you and we can come back to that later. Next slide, please, Alex. So if anyone who knows me knows that these shirts have probably been with me an awful long time. If anyone's known me in the last 20 years, these shirts have been my next uniform. When I left the Australian military in 1997, when I left the Navy, I started working as a youth worker for the Education Department. And one of the strange things that the Education Department insisted that we do as youth workers was go out and do home visits with families in a shirt and tie and a government car. So if you can imagine me pulling up in Medina, in Kwinana, or any of those sorts of areas, Willagee, in the late 1990s, and turning up at a house in a government car, stepping up with a button-up shirt and a tie to go and talk to a family about why their child isn't at school, and finding that the door didn't open at all, that's probably not really a big surprise. Most of the families that I was talking with were either Aboriginal people or people who lived in communities and suburbs where people didn't have a lot of money. People were struggling to get by and other things were impacting upon them in their life. And after about 2 weeks in, I just thought, this is ridiculous. No one's going to open their door to us. And I went back and I dug my shirts out of the cupboard. And that's when I started wearing them in 1998. These shirts were just a fun shirt that I used to wear at sea when I was in the Navy. We'd have a day off where we wouldn't wear uniform and we were allowed to wear bright coloured clothing and bright shirts and shorts and other things. We'd have a barbecue at sea. Sunday sea routine it was called, and this was called Pirate Rig. Awfully original, that. And we would be able to have half a day where we didn't have to wear a uniform and we could bounce about the ship making fun of each other and having a good laugh at the colours we decided to wear. And these shirts became what I grew up. And they stayed. I turned up my first house wearing my blunny boots, pair of shorts and my shirt out of my old ute. And the door opened and the bloke stepped out and said, "Who are you?" "Oh, I'm here to talk with you about so-and-so." "You're right, mate." And it went from there. And it stayed. You might not realise it, but actually these shirts have saved me from getting a box on the nose, kept me safe in most situations, and have actually put me in places where people look at me and go, "Well, you're a bit of a clown, mate. We'll dismiss you," and forget that I'm there. You'd be surprised how easy it is to hide. Well, you probably might not be actually. What am I saying? I'm assuming things. It's just really, really easy to hide out in plain sight when you sit there and put something like this and let everybody see you. And that changed the nature of how it was that I interacted with the world ever after. These shirts kept me safe and well. Next, please, Alex. And like I said, not too long ago, I started actually deciding that I would tell a story about it. And I became, well, I was originally started as a storyteller with barefaced stories. And I started sharing true stories because the nature of who we are as Aboriginal people is only ever presented to others as a yesterday's people. Whenever I get asked to go and to take part in an event or go and present, I've actually, late last year, when I talked about what it was that someone invited me to come along to a school to have a conversation about something after COVID, the restrictions around COVID eased off here in Perth. And I turned up at the school to talk with the principal about what it was that I could do as somebody who could present a story or a point of view. And the principal sort of looked at me and said, "Well, that sounds nice, but, do you think you could make it more Aboriginal?" And I'm sitting in front of her looking at her and going, "Well, is this not enough?" What she wanted me to do was turn up and do a dance and play a didgeridoo and get my boomerang and spear out of the cupboard and tell stories, Dreamtime stories of us as a peoples then, as a yesterday's peoples, as the curriculum tends to still push out through our education system today. I made a decision probably about 5 years ago that I wouldn't do that anymore, that I wanted to talk about us as a today's people, as contemporary people, alongside of the rest of us as Australians, and who we are together as Australians, because actually we too walk this path alongside of everybody else, alongside of you. And that's how we should be seen. And so much of what it is that we do presents us, so much of what the society still does today presents us as a yesterday's people, almost as if we don't have any real context in what our contemporary society, or a place in our contemporary society today. And I still enjoy the fact that it's actually the arts that probably leads the way on this and lets others have really good, meaningful conversations about it. And now this is where I make and play. Next, please, Alex. And I mean make. Because so much of what we do with these remind us of who we are in our stories. I teach people how to make spears and boomerangs and shields and other things the way that my grandfather taught me, the way that my uncles taught me, the way that people taught me then. And I park those things here to remind me that I too am still of that, and that business matters, because as I make, I remember and I tell my stories to my sons. And I have my sons' friends who are not Aboriginal boys and girls come over and make spears at my house around a fire, because this is where we live. This is our home. These are things that we can take part in and we share. We can have an appreciation of all these things. We don't have to claim these things. It's an appreciation of who we are, what makes us Australians. I'm not trying to say that what we are is Aboriginal if we make a spear or a boomerang. But sitting around with kids around a fire and just going, "Hey, try it like this, do that," and give them the hatchet so they don't chop their foot off. and letting them take part in this sort of activity just lets us have a conversation that's so much more real about who we are as Australians than what's presented in a classroom around the history books. Next slide, please, Lex. This is the last one, folks, before we go through what is it that's important about us. For you and your stories, name one or two historical or socially significant moments that has contributed to the person that you are today. I should have said that has, I've probably not loaded that well. So that could be something that occurred for you, something that occurred in and around you that, you know, should have happened longer ago, but when it did, it allowed you to be who you were. Maybe it was something that happened to your parents. Maybe it was something that happened in your grandparents' time. Maybe it was the nature of how the war, Second World War and First World War disturbed and distributed, you know, people as a result of circumstance. Maybe it was earlier than that. Maybe it was the right for women to vote. What is something that is historically or socially significant that has contributed to the nature of who you are as a person that makes today? What is it you anchor some of your stuff in, and why? I'm hoping that later on some of you get the opportunity to share some of this if we look at it in the timeline, if you're feeling brave, rather than listen to me blather on the other side over here. Can we go to the next one, please, Alex? Was I on mute for long, folks? My apologies. Oh, great. Thank you, Vanessa. So for us, and for me, particularly in my mob, Bardi mob, there's a man called Harry Hunter, who was a man chased out of his place and family. And he and another man called Frenchy d'Antoine set up their empire at the tip of Cape Levique, the tip of the Napier Peninsula. And they went into the East Kimberley and they stole Aboriginal people from their lands. And they chained them and they marched them to the tip of where they were so they could turn them into the slaves that they wanted to be. They would dive off the pearling luggers, but mostly when they first started, they set up the station country up there. And when it became clear that there was far more money to be made from the pearling industry, Harry Hunter and Frenchy d'Antoine took over both sides of King's Sound up there, one operating out of Derby and the other one operating out of the tip of the Napier Peninsula, Cape Levique. And they made their own workforce happen. Now, my great-grandfather, Harry Hunter, wasn't a very nice man. Many men died in their chains diving off of these pearl luggers. No one recovered the bodies. What men recall was that they recovered the chains because the chains are worth more. But we never had slavery in this country, did we? It was just blackbirding. Even as far as last year, the year before, and still this year, we have conversations about how slavery didn't exist in this country because it was called something else. But it did. And it's left its horrible mark all up and down this state and all over this country. And this is part of our story. That man, when he came in and took over our Bardi peoples and our lands, changed the nature of our families forever. And my family, my mum's maiden name was Hunter. Unfortunately, that man was a very cruel man, and he didn't care what he took. He had over 20 known wives, and I use wives very loosely, because Harry Hunter, a white man in that time, at the turn of the century, the 20th century, could take whatever he wanted, and he did. And often they would take women from one place, one camp, put them on the lugger, go to the next camp, dump that woman, pick up another woman, and go to the next camp. And that's pretty much how Harry Hunter lived with his wives. He would, amongst our Bardi Yowie mob, choose whoever he wanted to have at any particular time, and he took. And unfortunately, he taught his sons the same sort of thing. And my mother's actual father was another one of those men, my grandfather. Not the one that you've seen earlier in this slide, but another man. And it was as a result of him having 10 wives. My father, my grandfather, that man, didn't care about his children, didn't care what he made. The nature of the history was he'd learnt all he needed to know from Harry Hunter, and he passed that legacy down. Now, not all men were like that, but unfortunately, that shaped and decimated who we are as a people up in that place. And for our mob to still be on country and still hold on to their business is no small thing. I struggle with that man being my great-grandfather and that legacy being part of ours, because that man, wherever he could go with the Pearling Lugger from Torres Straits around, that man left his mark. And you can hear the name Hunter used amongst Aboriginal families from all the way around that, so down to here. Next slide, please, Alex. And this is why. Pearl shell. This is called Regi. So once a pearl shell has been shaped and carved and has its mark put on it, men would wear these around their waist on a hair belt, and this is called Regi. Before it gets shaped and carved and marked, it's simply just a flat pearl shell, which would then of course get processed for buttons and other things at the time when pearl shell was worth all of that, and pearls were worth that as an industry up in that part of the Kimberley. But before it would get shaped, it would just be a half of a pearl shell, and that was, we would call that guan in our language, in Bardi language. For us, this shell actually represents the nature of how it is that we're connected to that country and why our stories exist. Our stories tell us up there at the tip of the Napier Peninsula that the creation spirit, the serpent, came charging out of the sea with such force that when it crashed and landed on the headland to go and land, it hit and split the nature of that land apart and caused the islands to break away and become what it was in the King's Sound. You can see my wonderful hand doing all that stuff there. And when it did, the scales of that serpent scattered and splashed into the ocean. Men would go to that point where that story exists, and when they would have their dreams about the marks they would make on their pearl shells to tell their stories about who they are, when they go through their levels of law, they would go into those mud flats and search for pearl shells that are cast off inside that mud and the clay when they lay tides down, and they would pick the one that they would then decide, the guan, that they would then decide to carve, because those shells were considered to be the scales of the creation being, a creation serpent as it came up and crashed onto land and charged in land, you know, and took over and did it more of its business, creating stories for other people. For us, this is probably one of the most significant cultural objects that we have. And men would take their scale, shape it down, and put their dreams and their markings on it, and then wear that as a sign of who they were in their layers of manhood. And that still exists today. There are different types of pearl shells. They're marked in different ways to actually, so that men could go and take care of particular types of, different types of business. So when it's nesting season for the turtles, there would be men who would go and sing the country, and they would wear a pearl shell, much like what you see here, but would have different markings on it for turtle business. There would be men who would go and sing to the stingrays, and they would have a different pearl shell that would have a stingray marking on it, or sing about fish, or sing about fish traps as they go and prepare that next season for the next change of weather. This item, of course, we can find all over the world now as it's been traded and collected. In fact, many of the institutions have collections of these. National Gallery of Australia actually had a really interesting collection of about 90 works, I think it was, that was returned from a gentleman who lived in Israel. He'd collected about 90 of these particular shells and returned them to the National Gallery. I was there when they arrived, and I couldn't believe that this collection had come from Israel, from this particular person who had them for goodness knows how long in his own private collection. And for me, that was, I'd only ever seen them at a local level. I didn't realise that people had taken them and they'd gone and on and around the world in the way that they have. But just here in Australia, a pearl shell like this could leave Broome, be traded, you give me something, I give you something, and found all the way over in Adelaide and beyond towards Victoria. As it changed from hand to hand, people would add other layers and other stories and other things to it. They'd make their marks, they'd do their things, and it would be handed as a gift again as it sort of shifted through. And this is who we are in our stories. We do this. We make marks, we make things, we share things. We park ourselves in these incredible ways too. Next slide, please. Last year I took the steps to decommission some of my old shirts. This broke my heart. Those shirts that I've had since I left the Navy in 1997, I couldn't get rid of. I couldn't throw away my skins. I couldn't remove what they were and remove myself from them than I could them from me. And they sat in a pile in my cupboard because they'd given me so much comfort and protection for so long, but they were falling apart. And last year I decided to make a work about that, challenging myself, actually, as a result of what I did in 2019. I started talking with somebody about what it was that my skins were to me. When I put that exhibition together at the city of Joondalup in the JAG, one of the things that became very clear was me talking about the nature of all the different skins I'd worn to hide in as an Aboriginal man in our society, to try and not be what others would be frightened of, because people were frightened of me. People would call the police on me, and I would be doing not much more than just walking past or stopping and pausing somewhere. I've been thrown on the back of police cars and put in a cell a few times simply for being an Aboriginal man at the wrong place in the wrong suburb in cities, rather than hiding in some sort of uniform or something that could protect me. And these shirts did that in a remarkable way. For me, cutting up these shirts and actually turning them into an artwork was a big shift in how I saw myself historically, and how it was that I would decide to take part in the nature of our society and contribute socially today. Can we drop to the next slide, please, Alex? So this is the slide where we're going to invite you folks to, this is the one, isn't it, Alex?
Yep, that's right.
We're going to invite you folks to make marks. So all those questions when I said that, look, can you track one or two personal, professional and historical moments in your life? I'm going to ask you to consider, so you can see some gradients arriving on that timeline now. At the far end of that line is who we are today. This is 2021. At the other end, we're talking probably 1850, 1900, let's say, We can go back further if we like. But what I'd really like for you to get a sense of is that the gradients along as we go are 2000, 1950 maybe, yeah, 1800. All right, so we can do that. Why don't we do that? 1850, or 900, 1850, yes, 1800, and then 1750. Now, if you're feeling brave, folks, and you can actually fit it in there, and I'd like you to have a crack, I'd like for you to plot some of those things that you've decided to share, but we might, would you like to break out now, Alex, for that, or do that? We do that within the as is, within the PowerPoint as is. Sorry, we do, don't we?
We can do either. Do you want to go into a breakout room for people to decide which ones they want to? And have
Yeah, if we've got an option.
We might need to redraw it, Lily, but that's okay.
That's pretty good, Lily, though.
Cool. Thanks, Ron.
That's pretty cool. If you have the opportunity, and now's probably a good time, if we could actually perhaps break out. Oh, look, are there any questions you'd like to ask me at this point about this, to clarify this at all, folks? No? Yes.
Cool. So I reckon we might break, this is just a suggestion, we might break a good 15. So
yeah, let's have a...
That sound all right? And if people need to take a break, this would be the time to do it as well. So just in your groups, self-navigate that. So it's just 10:03, so I'll bring you back in 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, everyone's back.
Hi, everyone. Hope that didn't hurt too much. So we have a rough representation of a timeline in front of you, and I've tried to plot some of the things that I've mentioned over it. And really, I just invite you to do much the same. As you go, I'd like you to take some time and just add a sense of who you are on this timeline in much the way that I have. And in fact, I'm happy for it to get as messy as it needs to get. Because I think that's actually a pretty good representation of who we are in this place, and a conversation that we don't actually have very often. So please, I just invite for you to actually maybe draw much better lines than I did, and plot the nature of the date and some of those personal, professional, historical moments. You can catch it in as short or a simple way as you like. Use any colour, use any way that you'd like to do that for yourself. Really, I'm just trying to get a sense of how it is that we all connect to this timeline, and let you see it as we actually unfold it. So fill your boots, folks, and plot yourself on that timeline.
And just let us know if you can't find the Annotate tool or you haven't used it before.
That's me, Lily. I don't know how to do what you're talking about.
So Vanessa, if you just go up into View Options,
yeah,
which should be at the top of the screen, and you click on View Options, you should see an Annotate choice. And if you click the Annotate choice, then you'll see that you've got a choice to add a text box and draw a hand-drawn line. So you should then be able to draw directly onto the timeline.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just some hot tips. You might want to format the text to a smaller text or not. And the eraser button is very useful to erase things, to redo them.
You have no idea how many times I used the eraser button in the 15 minutes that you fellas had. And please feel free to make your marks any way you like. I'm not after anything pretty. I just really like to get a sense of how it is that we think we see ourselves and our stories mapped across this timeline.
How do you make the, hi everyone, how do you make the text smaller? Is there a shortcut for that?
If you go to in the text, there's a format button that's like a little square color thing. Can you see that?
Okay.
If you click that, it kind of gives you all the options for a text size. If you've already clicked on text, if you've clicked on something else, oh no, it still does it. Yeah, format.
Oh, I can't get back to that one, but so text and then format. Oh yeah, cool. Oh, cool. Thank you.
Great.
Yep.
Hey Alex, Rebecca here. I can't even get the drawing going.
Are you on a Mac?
I'm not a very good artist.
Are you on a computer?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you take your mouse up to the top of the screen, you'll get a little drop down button, and there'll be options, and then you click annotate.
No, I've just minimized the whole thing. Hang on. Where am I? View. Oh crap. So I've only got far out. I've got no.
No.
I've done this before, but in a different program. Meh.
Have you downloaded the Zoom app, or are you working from the desktop, from the
I'm just working through like the link on a laptop.
Yeah, that might be why. I don't know what the instructions are.
Oh, that's all right.
From that, sorry.
Okay, I'll keep trying.
Playing. You want to look for an options and annotate.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll give it a crack. Thank you.
That, or simply plot it in front of yourself, if you like, Rebecca, and just add aspects of depth, say, not if yourself, perhaps maybe for those around you as well, and just a sense of what that timeline looks like for you and then others around you. Just as a demonstration of what that extends it to itself. If it's just on a piece of paper, it's really just a way for us to actually just see it and consider ourselves across it. You might overlay it as you go.
Thanks, Ron.
Ron, you're muted because I could see you were talking.
Yes, I was muttering to myself in the background here. That's why I was muted.
That's great. Go ahead. Just checking.
Thanks for coming, Gavin. Appreciate it. How are we doing? Tool. Perhaps another 5 minutes, Alex? Yeah.
Sure.
I want to just make
We
sure
do
we've
a
got
little
time for
bit
people.
less.
Yep, okay, sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
up
Yep.
to you, really.
No, more than happy. If people are comfortable now, we can actually, you know, as you go, you can just talk about it as people are plotting and going. Yeah. So even just with 16 of us being present and taking part in this now, you get a really good sense of just how busy this timeline is with our stories. You get a sense of that depth of how complex we are. Just a touch, you know, it's not just who we are sitting in this particular spot now, it's those that came before us. It's our ancestors and our ancestors' ability to survive and keep that story and that line through that actually comes all the way to where we are now in another person's ancestral place and home with our feet on the ground in this timeline. You bring all of what makes up you and you put it here because you exist. And we don't stop to consider that as Australians. I actually have done this particular activity with all kinds of people in many different places. And one of the most interesting was I did it for a group of nearly 200 technicians and tradies and support staff at a marine engineering firm here in Perth. And in fact, we needed such a big space that we actually went out the back into the workshop. And when I do this activity, I generally just use a big long strip of masking tape and I run it around a wall. Well, in this time I had to run the masking tape across the workshop floor. And then I got down on my hands and knees and I wrote the dates along that masking tape. And I invited each of the workers to come up and put a post-it note. They had 3 post-it notes for each colour, for each heading. And I invited for each of them to plot 3 different personal stories, 3 different professional stories, and 3 different historical stories across that timeline. And we left it there. Now, that maritime engineering company had just prior to when COVID hit in 2020, had actually just amalgamated from 3 different international locations across Australia. And at the time, many of their key people were here in Australia where their central office had been put. And they were stuck, they were caught here. And they were struggling for about 2 months to get a sense of who they were, trapped in their stories and their bits and pieces of being away from their family and not being able to return. And this became not just a timeline activity, but a team building activity as we sat down and we considered who all of these remarkably different people were that were all the same because they worked for this company. They were from Singapore, the UK, and of course Australia. And they had to stop and reconsider the nature of who they were in a time like this in Noongar Budja. And the man who was actually in charge of that office was a fellow probably about my same age who grew up in the southwest of Western Australia on a small farm. And he left that location, I think, I can't remember now which town, but he left that location, small town, and got going as quick as he possibly could. And he found himself working in the maritime industry. We had similar stories. Now, I've not met a man who's actually I've not met too many people who've delivered or done their homework to the extent that this man did, but he was from a generation of farmers down in the southwest, probably 5 generations. And he introduced me perfectly. He then talked about why it was important for him as a boy who grew up in the southwest of Western Australia that we stopped and considered who we were on this very old land. I didn't have to do anything really in my lead up. I just went, oh, you've just stolen all my thunder. Thank you very much. And he set the scene in such a beautiful way that what we could do is have a conversation about who we were on this timeline and then what we brought from it from all of our own family points of view. And just looking at this, just stopping to think about who you are. You know, some of you are from Abuja, but I think most of you are from over east, joining us from over east, and in difficult times. Some of you have been not like much. We've been very lucky in Western Australia. COVID hasn't necessarily impacted us in ways that it has, say, in New South Wales, Victoria. We have been able to stop, I guess. Sorry, let me reframe that. We haven't had a chance to stop and think necessarily in this time, just how bloody fortunate we are. Look at who you are. Even in amongst the nature of what we're actually all presented with today, the challenges of actually trying to create, make and do as artists, working in art institutions, arts professionals, trying to challenge this country and others about why this business about the arts matters. Look at who we are. Stop and consider who you are when you put your feet down on the land of other peoples that you've added to in the place that you call home now. Because you too are of that place. And you too add value to it. Is there anyone who'd like to personally share perhaps an example of a personal moment that they believe may have shifted the nature of who they were significantly in their life? One or two? Anyone would like to actually have a crack at that? This is generally when I open the floor and say, please, you know, tip in and share with me the nature of some of that. There's some, I see some remarkable things on this timeline, but if you'd like to actually share something, please do. I think I've squawked enough.
I'll go if no one else is.
Please, Rebecca. Thank you.
So last year in lockdown, home isolation, I started studying online, and one of the classes, the teacher turned out to be a complete ignorant, racist, horrible person. And it was a really strange feeling to be sitting in my own home on my own and feel that feel unsafe in my own home. And it really messed with me. And thankfully I've got a supportive family, and I gave my brother a call and told him what happened, and he said, no, that's really messed up. And I went through an official complaints process with the Indigenous Student Support Services through the TAFE, and they got student advocacy involved, and I sent in a 4-page complaint officially, and it was a huge kind of personal moment for me in that it was almost like the straw that broke the camel's back. It's like, no, I've put up with this shit for too long, and to have that in my own home, like, that's no. So, and also it made me realise that I wasn't on my own, and even though like this course I'm doing might not even get me anywhere in like career-wise, it's the fact that it's helped me in a sense become stronger in my identity and realised that because I always felt on my own when I'm attacked by people who are racist, but to go through this process with such support was really incredible, and it's kind of changed everything for me, because I've realised I'm not on my own. People will listen, and people do care, and it's not just me that's at breaking point too. Like this, we're all kind of going, enough's enough. We're not just calling out people, but we're also holding them to account, especially if they're in a teaching setting.
Yes.
So that was huge. And now that's turned into the TAFE are actually starting their own Indigenous student charter, and we've got our first meeting next week.
More power to you, Rebecca.
So yeah.
You know, like as countrymen anchored in who we are, you know, the sense of how others view us, assume things about us, make conversation about us, as today's people.
And that's what really, really pissed me off with this guy, this teacher, was he was talking about his teaching experiences in East Arnhem Land, and he's talking about mob up there who have no idea that he's talking about them. They can't go through the complaint process like I can, because I'm down here and I'm recording everything he's saying. And it was that, and I thought, if he's saying this in every class to hundreds of people, far out, like I got to cut this, you know, I can't let him keep going.
And there's scales, you know, like the sense of how our curriculum informs other Australians, fellow Australians, about who we are as an Aboriginal peoples and Islander peoples. And, you know, it can be on one side of this and it can be on this. People have different opinions and thoughts. Really, people can really poison that world.
Yes.
And it carries on, and it carries on, and it carries on.
Yep.
And we're working in a particular area where we want to challenge so much of that. We want to present us as who we are in our skin today. And I don't care which other you are that any of the world might measure you in your stories. But this notion that the other is something that we should be scared about, the other is something that we shouldn't actually acknowledge, the other is something that we push to one side that isn't about the rest of us. No, we are who we are. And this timeline, this simple activity, really shows that. We are all of this together. You can't take any one person off this timeline and dismiss them for anything, and you can anyone else. We sit in our stories on this timeline together. And if you're going to sit there and be somebody who occupies this timeline and says, but my story matters, hey, so do theirs. And so does that person, and so does that person, and so does that person. We live on this timeline together. We are Australians together, and that's how we can challenge people about this. So thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks. Over and out.
Anyone else like to have a go? What about something professional, a professional or an employment shift for you that actually helped you go in a different direction and perhaps contributed to the person that you are? I know, it's terrible, isn't it? Fancy getting this far in and asking people to tip in. You already have. Well, I'm a high school dropout that was forced to drop out as a result of not being allowed to take part in my high school classes in year 8 and year 10 because I was an Aboriginal boy and I was kicked out because of that. In fact, I had a teacher in 1981 at social studies just after he finished his Captain Cook session go, and I asked about, when he finished his delivery about that business, he turned around and looked at me as one of the Aboriginal boys in the class and said, what about the Aboriginal people? What about the Aborigines, Ron? You're just going to die a drunk bum in the park. Get out of my class. And unfortunately, the school that I went to, he was allowed to say that in country Western Australia. And he had several mates at the school who did as well. And my first year of high school, my year 8, was shut down. And the problem was that there were 13 of us in that classroom, 13 Aboriginal people. So as soon as he said that, 13 Aboriginal students got up and went out because we'd all heard that word before. He kept us out of that class, and his fellow teachers kept us out of their classes. There's only 2 classes I was allowed to take part in year 8 in 1981. And that was English and Industrial Arts. In year 9, I was able to go back in because I had a whole different group of teachers. But in year 10, I had all those teachers again. I was forced to repeat year 10 at another school in 1984. And that's when I noticed things were different, because the other school was nothing like that. The principal from the school that I went to beforehand, he encouraged that sort of stuff. He, in fact, he fully supported it. He didn't like Aboriginal people either. And so my grounding in who it was that I believed I was as an Aboriginal boy growing into becoming an Aboriginal man was anchored in other people's business. And that shaped me all the way through till I actually came back one day from the Navy and challenged that man. That's a story for another time. I'll leave it be, but things occur still today for any person in their otherness that actually park them just like that. And that's a sad thing that we live in any society. What about a historical moment, folks? What is a really significant historical moment within our country that you think has contributed, or in fact, not even necessarily within our country, but from your own stories, I should say, that you think has contributed to the person you are? There's some interesting things plotted on this timeline. Certainly, the Irish family is one of the ones that's touched on so many different countries across the world.
I'll go again if no one else wants to. Mainly because there's in that big gap there in the early 1830s was a huge thing for my family and I, where and many others, where one of my grandmothers was kidnapped from Mornington Peninsula, down the bottom there, where they stole lots of women and took them, I think, a few different places, but mainly to Bass Strait Islands. So that's, and now I'm working on her country. So that's a huge thing for me.
That's a hugely significant thing, Rebecca. Yeah. And that's a conversation you and I should probably have another time.
Yeah, we have similar horrible white blokes in our family tree.
The nature of that, of course, is all over Australia. We only see up to 1750 here at this time, and people have come and gone across aspects of us and other places across the world where they've left their mark in all manners of ways. And unfortunately, most of those weren't very, very nice. And yet we are still people in our stories. We are still incredible people in our stories. We are still incredibly strong in our stories. We bring that strength. We bring that amazing difference, same but different, I don't know. And we park it here in our timeline. I see artists make incredible artwork parked in their stories. And I see institutions representing them really, really well. And I see the challenges still that exist and be able to represent us as contemporary people who share our stories together and perhaps meaningfully collaborate as we make and grow ideas and stories. I think we might, if there's nothing else to contribute, I think we might go back to the PowerPoint, Alex, and get ready to wrap up and leave some space for a question. What do you think?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Let me just wrangle that.
Because I do want to actually give you the opportunity to ask questions, folks, if you want to, and we can tip in, but I will try and close us off with those questions. These are things that we need to stop and consider, who we are in our stories. You're a remarkable people. If you get a chance, please stop, have a cup of tea after this, and just take time to think about who you are and the difference that it makes when you put your feet down in this place and you connect to it and you become one with that you actually give life to as well. Think about the conversations you might have with others about why it matters. Think about why you make. Think about how it is that you challenge and why it is that you challenge people the way that you do. But celebrate who you are, because you're amazing people. And that's pretty cool. Could we go to the next slide, please? This is the ship's number of the ship I served on HMAS West Australia. And this number stays in my head right up to this day. It was such a long time ago. But the 8th of May is something that I just can't let slip. And I've made work tips in and around this, and I continue to make work in and around just this number and the nature of that ship. But what you can see just down the bottom line there underneath the black is these pearl shells scattered along the base of the floor. This work wraps around an L-shaped gallery, and whilst everything visual above the floor line talks about my saltwater story trapped between being a Bardi man and a Navy man, looks quite obvious. If people tip into it, they can read the statement. Down below each of those pearl shells represent a sailor that I served with in that crew. There are 100 pearl shells on the ground. And I invited sailors to come back and interact with this artwork as a private invitation. To turn over a pearl shell, have one turned over, and I marked it with ochre for who they were when they served alongside of me as another saltwater brother in my tribe, for that mob there. And they become a part of the story that I shared with the public who came and saw the show. We can make incredible artwork together that actually talks about who we are together, because our stories intertwine in all kinds of ways. I really do invite artists to have good conversations about that. Next slide, please. Last year, I was incredibly lucky in the sense that one of the works that I made out of those shirts that I cut up turned into what you see there in front of you. This is the Napier Art Prize at the Australian War Memorial. And I got brave. This art prize is actually for ex-serving and currently serving Australian Defence Force personnel. And I tipped my hat into the ring with about 480 other people as I had a crack at seeing whether an artwork that I could make could arrive and sit inside of the Australian War Memorial. I actually didn't think I had a hope in hell. I thought what I was challenging them with was too much. But what I did was created a work that was a yowie suit. And if you are not familiar with a yowie suit or a ghillie suit, when I first joined the army, we would sit in observation posts over places up in the Pilbara and the Kimberley in a camouflage suit, hiding in a spot, looking out over key areas and watching people coming in and out, mostly drugs being dropped on the coast of Western Australia. And we would work with the Coast Guard, or not Coast Guard, sorry, Customs, to plot and track and record those illegally entering and dropping goodies that they shouldn't be dropping in places. And we would share, there'd be a 5-man team sitting in that place, and we would share this horrible, smelly camouflage suit that we would all take turns in sitting on the hill with a pair of binoculars looking out. It was all about camouflage. It was all about hiding out in the open and trying not to be seen. And then I realised, of course, that's what I've been doing for years with the shirts that I've been wearing across the term of my life. And about the middle of my 40s or late 40s, I just decided I wasn't going to hide anymore. And I took my skins off, some of them. And I created this work. And that work, called In Plain Sight, is actually made up of strips of all of the different skins I've worn since I went into the Defence Force as a 19-year-old boy and came out with the shirts that I had afterwards. as a way of just discussing how it was that I spent all that time hiding, I guess, and that I wouldn't do it anymore. And I parked it there. In fact, they acquired that work earlier this year. So that was a win for me. Next slide, please, Alex. Here in Wajak Buja, Noongar country, the bulgur tree or the xantharia or the grass tree is a hugely significant tree for Noongar people. This tree gives people life. We have trees around here that you can find in some places that are over 500 to 800 years old still because they grow incredibly strong. And they've seen people come and they'll see us go. This is in the city of Perth's council buildings down in there, right in the city of centre of the Perth itself proper. And it's in a response to an exhibition that was put together called Satellite, talking about how Skylab was tracking across, I think the late 70s, across the sky, the Western Australian skyline, to describe that very well, and how Perth got this nickname, the City of Light. And they asked me to reflect on that. What do I think about that? What do they think I could actually do that actually talked about that from a, an Aboriginal person's point of view? And I said, well, before you mob had lights that were electric and were able to capture by that particular thing zipping past, Noongar people have been on the banks of this river with their fires from these trees for hundreds and hundreds of years beforehand. And so inside that space, I installed this tree and I work up the back against Brendan Van Heck's work, which I got to be cheeky about. Just again reminding us that we sit on an old piece of land and we share our stories. It was nice to bring them inside and challenge that exhibition that time. The last slide, please, Alex. And that's me coming out. At about the time that George Floyd and all of that went off, I was making this work, and this became incredibly personal and real for me. Because I was putting on bits and pieces of things, nothing but a thread, nothing but a bit of cloth, that I'd used to defend myself in situations that could have been very, very ugly and much worse. There are times where I've been grabbed on the North Shore in Fremantle in Sydney, and bundled up against a wall, handcuffed and pushed into the back of a car because I was in the cities and I was an Aboriginal man and I was looking at a brand new Mercedes-Benz while my white friend was around the corner in the deli getting himself a packet of cigarettes. I was still sitting in the car with my hands handcuffed and in the seat when my friend came out of the store and went, "Oi, what are you lot doing?" to the coppers. And the coppers said, "Bugger off, mate, it's none of your business." We just stepped across the road from the naval base that was just across the road and down the walkway. We just finished our day's work. And I was in the cities because we were going home. And he said, "We've just come off the base. We're a couple of sailors. Have you checked his ID yet?" And the coppers just sort of scoffed at him and said, "Well, what for?" The other one reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, opened it up, and right there was my Navy ID, Royal Australian Navy, Ronald Bradfield, ABETW, and my serial number. And without a word, the handcuffs were unlocked. I was pulled out of the car, my wallet was thrown at me, and they drove away. Now that doesn't happen as often today, but it still happens. That can happen a lot less if we're not still painting a picture that says that there's us and them inside of this country of ours. In fact, it's just us. And so I invite you all to just stand and put your feet down on this timeline and celebrate your stories and celebrate who you are and look in and around you and celebrate all those others, because we're a remarkable group of people and I think we've got wonderful things to actually build on and grow from and learn. So thank you. I think that's that. So we've got, I think, probably 5 minutes now that I've eaten up all your time, but if you want to ask a question, you can. By the way, I also tend to make my email available if people want to wing me a question. If you prefer that you wouldn't like to necessarily have one here and you want to do that, you can. I'm actually quite happy to share my email and have you wing me an email and kick off a conversation. More than happy for that to happen. If you've got awkward questions that you don't necessarily want to actually ask out loud here, email it. I'm actually completely happy to tip in and have a conversation and have yarns with folks about, you know, how it is that you see things, how you feel about things, exploring things. I'm not by any means a cultural expert in anyone else's business. I'm just one fella who has one story amongst all of your stories. And I'm happy to help stories have a conversation about them and have a chat. Yeah. So thank you for coming along.
Zoe?
Ron, thank you. I was going to ask a question about your shirt because you've been on such a journey with the shirts and you've got a shirt on today. What is it feeling like now wearing the shirt?
More that I can just actually sit freer in them, I think. So, I just, you know, just they've been me for so long. In fact, actually, the funny thing is that when I don't wear them here and I go around in a T-shirt, every now and then I actually get dressed up in a suit and a tie. People don't see me. I disappear. And I actually have to physically go out and touch someone on the shoulder and say, hi. And they look at me and they do a double take and they go, oh, Ron. So, yeah, it's actually not too bad now. I think when I took off the weight of those shirts in what they were previously before and I turned them into that artwork, they stopped having that shadow behind them for me. And they became something I could just have fun with and celebrate. Now, for those of you who joined us from Victoria, you're being squeezed a fair bit over there with the changes again. Thank you for coming along. You might take good care in your business now. Yeah, still look after yourselves. Clearly this time of COVID hasn't changed in the sense of how it's squeezing us all as a mob, as a nation and a peoples. Make sure you do look after yourself, please. Especially that sense of the nature of how that's been, in fact, exactly what you're talking about, Rebecca, how we've been forced to live within our homes and bring others into that space. We should be mindful of that, you know, and perhaps letting yourself put your feet down and stand for yourself in your stories is a fair thing for all. Thank you, folks. I think that's probably enough, isn't it? Thanks so much for coming.
Ron, thank you so much for your truth-telling and your generosity. You are a phenomenal storyteller, and this has opened lots of, again, thinking about having our feet on this country. Do take Ron up on his invitation to reach out, and thank you so much from us for making it possible to arrive here today. We know that that was a big journey to make that work for you. So thank you so much for your generosity and staying with us through that process to arrive here. And thanks so much to everyone for coming. Take care if you're in Melbourne. I hope this week goes fast.
Take good care, folks. Ciao.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.